delighted to be asked to speak at the second European IAFOR Conference on the Arts and Humanities. And there is no doubt to me that this conference builds on the success of IAFOR's endeavour to construct bridges not only between Asia and the West, but also between different academic disciplines. My eye was drawn to an idea floated on the conference website that the dialectic engendered by diversity, although it may lead to conflict, can play an important role in the expansion of ideas in communities and societies. And I like the challenge implicit in this concept. So this morning, I'll try to produce evidence from history to demonstrate how the random nature of human contact propelled one of the most interesting and profound examples of the exchange of ideas in the industrial age. And I'm referring to a period of just 50 years, between 1858 and the end of the Meiji era in 1912, when Japan emerged as a world power. It's a period which allowed a dialectic to emerge, fueled on the one hand by intense curiosity in the West about Japan's distinctive cultural differences, and on the other hand, by a reciprocal thirst for Western technology to drive rapid economic change, and thus alter forever the geopolitics of Asia. And there's no doubt in my mind that this period of history is the crucible in which modernism was formed. Appreciation of the distinctiveness of Japanese culture developed rapidly following the dispatch of several diplomatic missions to Japan in the summer of 1858. During that year, as Stuart has alluded, a treaty of amity and commerce between the UK and Japan was negotiated by my great-great-grandfather, James Bruce, the 8th Earl of Elgin. His brief visit accorded with those of his contemporaries that Japan, to some degree, resembled an Arcadian utopia, defined by a remarkable emphasis on cleanliness, a strict social order, and a studied harmony with the natural environment. He founded Japan where the social and moral condition has astonished me as much as its material beauty. And his successor, Sir Rutherford Alcott, who served as British Minister in Tokyo until 1864, concurred with this view, writing that he saw peace, plenty, apparent content, and a country more perfectly cultivated and kept than can be matched even in England. British diplomats were not blind to the opportunities that awaited Japan as it opened up its economy to international trade. Interestingly, there was never any doubt in Elgin's mind that the Japanese would find it easy to assimilate Western technology. They're competent to manage their own steam engines and to navigate their own ships, he wrote. They're extremely sensitive at being supposed incapable of acquiring any branch of knowledge which is possessed by others, and have a high estimate of their powers in this respect. Within a year of this treaty being ratified, a young Scottish businessman, Thomas Blake Glover, sailed from Hong Kong to Nagasaki to trade in tea, on the instructions of his employers, the Scottish Oriental Trading Company, Jardine Matheson. With the opening of trade, it was almost inevitable that Scottish mercantile interests would be well represented in Japan. Over the next decade, Glover played an instrumental role, critically altering the balance of power between the Tokugawa government and the rebellious Choshu and Satsuma clans. He armed the latter with Enfield rifles and gunboats built to order by Hall Brothers of Aberdeen. Glover's role as an agent of change, which hastened the end of a medieval power structure and the dawn of the Meiji era, has ensured him an heroic status in Japanese history. His role as an entrepreneur, personally assuming the risk of substantial industrial ventures in coal mining and shipbuilding, underlies the importance of his contribution to Japan. In 1865, he imported the first steam locomotive, and 2 years later he acquired the first Western-built ships for the Japanese Navy. The modern origins of Mitsubishi date from the acquisition of his dockyard and mining interests, and he's still revered in Japan as the founder of the Kirin Brewery. The house he built in 1863, overlooking Nagasaki Bay, is a national monument, attracting 2 million visits each year. The stereotype of the 19th century wandering Scot, well-educated and enterprising, a product of one of the best educated societies in Europe, is embodied in Glover. Scotland created the conditions that produced some of the world's most successful entrepreneurs. In the United States, immigrant Scots such as Andrew Carnegie built industrial empires that dominated this newly rich and increasingly powerful country. And the same pattern held true in Australia, Canada, and India. But in Japan, very few Scots were able to establish themselves and their descendants as a distinct immigrant community. Most were recruited on contracts by successive Meiji governments, primarily for their expertise as university professors or consulting engineers. Their task would be help the transition of a redundant samurai class into a technocracy, and to equip Japan with public infrastructure necessary to unleash high rates of economic growth. But it's arguable that Glover's most significant accomplishment was less tangible than these achievements, but nonetheless had an enormous impact, ultimately, on the speed with which Japan entered the modern age. In May 1863, in the midst of an armed standoff between a Royal Navy flotilla and the governor of Nagasaki, Glover was approached by the Choshu clan, one of the principal territorial families at war with the Tokugawa shogunate. He was asked to organize the safe passage for 5 of their brightest youths to the west. Spirited away to avoid arrest and certain death, the young samurai left Nagasaki on one of Glover's ships, bound for Yokohama, and thence to Shanghai on a Jardine ship, their heads shaved to resemble Chinese coolies. Transferring to the 300-ton Pegasus and his sister ship, the White Adder, they survived a perilous journey around the Cape and arrived in London some 5 months later. At a ceremony last year to commemorate the 150th anniversary of this event, the Japanese ambassador spoke movingly of the personal care and attention given by specific individuals to ensure the welfare of the 5. On arriving in London, they were greeted by Glover's younger brother and immediately enrolled in University College under the tutelage of a Scots-born professor of chemistry, Alexander Williamson. Williamson's wife, Catherine, provided their board and lodging, and each weekend they dined at Hampstead with Hugh Matheson, a founding partner of Jardines. Matheson shared his dining table with the future foreign minister, the future director of railways, and the future director of the Osaka Mint. The future Minister of Works and founder of the Imperial College of Engineering, Yozo Yamao, did not complete the University College course, but moved to Glasgow in 1866, where he enrolled at Anderson College, later the University of Strathclyde, to study marine engineering. But Matheson's most distinguished dinner guest, Ito Hirobumi, the most gifted member of the 5, would later become the Meiji Emperor's first Prime Minister, serving on 4 occasions between 1886 and 1901. A sense of the trauma that must have been experienced by the Choshu 5 as they docked in London can be understood from the account of Yukichi Fukuzawa, who had arrived in Europe the previous year. "We all wore our Japanese dress, with a pair of swords in our girdles, and appeared on the streets of London in such attire," he wrote. "A sight indeed it must have been." In a valiant attempt to assist the cultural integration of his countrymen, Fukuzawa commissioned a guidebook to everyday clothes and so on in European style, which was published in November 1867. The guidebook provides advice in exhaustive detail of how Japanese travellers should adopt the manners and dress of Europeans. There is a washstand in the Western-style bedroom. They wash their face, hands and teeth every morning and after a meal. After putting on their clothes, they wear perfume to keep it clean. All in all, the Western person likes to be clean more than the Japanese do. Under the bed is a chamber pot. There is always at least one chamber pot in their bedroom. If you travel in the West for the first time, you often take it as an ornament. Be careful. In 1872, after the restoration of the Meiji Emperor, the Iwakura mission was dispatched to Europe and the United States. The 3 main objectives of the mission were to secure high-level international recognition for Japan's newly restored imperial regime, to open discussions on the revision of treaties signed in 1858, and to assess Western civilization, with a view to adopting those parts of value to Japan. Over 100 diplomatic staff were attached to the mission. Many had never left Japan before, and only a few spoke foreign languages. Accompanying the mission as Vice Ambassador, Ito Kiribumi retraced the friendships forged from his student days in the previous decade. On the advice of Yozo, he travelled to Glasgow University to meet the Professor of Civil Engineering, John Corn Rankin. Kiribumi asked Rankin about the necessary steps needed to establish a Japanese armaments industry. Rankin explained that Japan would need a steel mill, but before that it would need well-trained engineers. And before leaving the United Kingdom, the mission took the advice not only of Rankin, but also Sir William Thomson, Professor of Natural Philosophy at Glasgow, undoubtedly Scotland's greatest living scientist, and appointed Henry Dyer, a 22-year-old Scottish engineering lecturer, as the first Professor of Engineering and Principal of the Imperial College of Engineering in Tokyo. Dyer sailed for Japan in April 1873, together with a faculty of 13 teaching staff, 7 of whom had graduated from Scottish universities. But so rushed was his appointment, he had to spend the voyage preparing an outline for a 6-year engineering course, which included mathematics, natural philosophy, telegraphy, chemistry, physics, civil engineering, geology, and English literature. His reign at the Imperial College lasted for 9 years and ensured that an entire generation of Japanese leaders would benefit from being taught a broadly based Scottish syllabus in English. To further his students' practical application of engineering, he established the Akabane Engineering Works, the first practical facility for teaching engineering in Japan. And for many years after his return to Scotland in 1881, he continued to place Japanese students in British universities. With his prompting, Glasgow became the first European university to permit Japanese as an entry language. In 1901, Sanpachi Fukuzawa, whose father Yukichi had established the University of Keio in Tokyo, was the first student to take advantage of this initiative. His external examiner was none other than Sasaki Natsume, who had just arrived in London, where he was to spend, in his own words, the most unpleasant years in my life. Among English gentlemen, I lived in misery, like a poor dog that had strayed among a pack of wolves. His misery was relieved by a trip to Scotland, where he was enchanted by a visit to Pitlochry. There, his host, John Dixon, had laid out a beautiful Japanese garden. The Edinburgh-based Stevenson Brothers, a family firm famous for designing lighthouses, also welcomed Japanese engineering students. The Stevenson had already been contracted by the Meiji government to build 26 lighthouses around the Japanese coast. It was with this company that Kurichiro Sugi, an engineering student attending Edinburgh University, was awarded a placement to learn technical drawing. He befriended Robert Louis Stevenson, the youngest son of the head of the firm. Stevenson had never visited Japan, but through Sugi and other Japanese contacts, he developed a fascination for the country and its history. He was among the first Western writers to identify a Japanese folk hero as the epitome of national character, in the biographical tradition of Macaulay and Carlyle. Stevenson wrote a sketch of the life of a great Japanese patriot, Yoshida Showa, whom he refers to as Torashiro, which appeared in a collection of short biographies published in 1882 as familiar studies of men and books. Stevenson confidently placed Yoshida in the company of such figures as Robert Burns, Walt Whitman, Henry Thoreau, and Samuel Pepys. He saw him as an important transitional figure, embedded in an ancient culture, trying to come to terms with the challenge brought about by rapid globalization. Yoshida represented the samurai class, whose purpose had been eclipsed by the need for a professional bureaucracy, and who were finding it increasingly difficult to preserve the purity of an island culture. Stevenson empathized with this predicament and encouraged his readers to assimilate the uniqueness of Japan before it might be lost forever. The use of heroic figures such as Yoshida as a literary device to embody distinctive aspects of national character appears again and again in the work of both Stevenson and Sir Walter Scott. While Stevenson's family profited from building lighthouses to ease navigation and begin the practical task of opening up Japan to overseas trade, he saw his role as more of an archaeologist, salvaging Japan's history and heritage before it was swallowed up by the relentless tide of westernization. He appointed himself as the keeper of Japan's distinctive national identity, finishing his essay on Yoshida with the observation, "I hope the reader will not fail to perceive that this is as much the story of an heroic people as that of an heroic man." In the year that Stevenson's Familiar Studies was published, the Glasgow Corporation opened the Oriental Art Loan exhibition at the Kelvin Grove Galleries. The city had been fortunate enough to receive a gift from the Japanese government of over 1,000 items, representing traditional decorative arts drawn from every prefecture. Forming the core collection of the exhibition, the galleries also borrowed extensively from the Victoria and Albert Museum and from private collectors. Over 30,000 visitors toured the exhibition. There is no doubt that it had an enormous impact. In the Glasgow City Museum Annual Report of 1882, it was noted that Glasgow School of Art students attended regularly and used the collection for the purpose of continuous study. And to coincide with the exhibition, the corporation invited Christopher Dresser to give a lecture on Japanese art. Born in Glasgow in 1834, Dresser's role as a cultural bridge between Japan and Britain has never lost its significance. Emerging as a leading industrial designer and prolific writer, he published The Art of Decorative Design in 1862. It was a seminal work. In 1877, he spent 3 months in Japan as the guest of the Japanese government, where he travelled extensively. On returning to Britain, he addressed the Royal Society of Arts on the art manufactures of Japan, and later published his principal work, Japan, Its Architecture, Art and Art Manufactures. During his tour of Japan, Dresser had made a point of visiting factories and workshops, as well as temples and gardens. He visited 68 different potteries and porcelain makers. He visited manufacturers of bamboo and basket works, furniture, lacquer, textiles, embroideries, enamels, cloisonné, toys and paper. It has been claimed that he probably did more for the enlightenment of Japanese art than any other European scholar and designer during this period. Dresser used the vantage point of his extensive tour of craft workshops to develop a closer understanding of the integrity of Japanese craftsmanship. Describing the work of an experienced potter, he was unable to resist the temptation to romanticize the role of the Japanese worker. He wrote, "I've watched the poor artisan labouring at his work with an earnestness and love such as I've never beheld outside Japan. No thought of gain appears to enter their minds, and no touch is spared which will make the work more lovely. This is how the beautiful works which we delight to look upon are produced." This view, stated so authoritatively by Dresser, was to develop a strong resonance with the arts and crafts movement. In contrast to this encyclopedic knowledge of Japanese decorative arts, the artist James McNeill Whistler cultivated an intuitive understanding of Japanese aesthetic principles. The Massachusetts-born Whistler took great pride in his Scottish roots, adopting his mother's surname McNeill in place of his second Christian name. He never visited Japan, but he developed a fascination for Japanism, collecting woodblock prints, textiles and ceramics in Paris in the early 1860s. For artists such as Degas and Whistler, Japanese decorative art offered a new freedom from imitative or photographic representation. It suggested new angles of vision and an entirely different treatment of perspective. The use of bold, unshaded colour for its own sake in flatter compositions encouraged a trend towards abstraction. Strong diagonals, the silhouette, cropped up close partial views of objects in the foreground, and a flexible approach to blank space. In pioneering this new approach to visual art, Whistler earned the opprobrium of Britain's foremost art critic, John Ruskin, following the exhibition of his Nocturne in Black and Gold, Falling Rocket, in 1877, the painting which is shown on this slide. Clearly, Ruskin's empiricism did not allow him the leap of imagination which would have connected Whistler's Nocturne and Hiroshige's fireworks at Ryogoki Bridge. He seemed unaware of the status of the night sky in Japanese aesthetics. A celebrated encounter between the aesthetes Hogetsu and Chogu established that a moonlit night has a strange paradox. On the one hand, it is dim and twilight, and on the other hand, clear and transparent. The sense of beauty in a moonlit night lies in the in-between of them. Instead, Ruskin blasted the ill-educated conceit of the artist, which so nearly approached the aspect of willful imposture. I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public space. Whistler sued Ruskin for libel. Questioned during the trial if the 2 days spent on painting the Nocturne were worth the 200 guineas which he had sought for the painting, Whistler replied, "No, I ask it for the knowledge of a lifetime." Nowadays, critics regard Whistler's Nocturne as a vital curtain raiser for the modernist movement. But sadly, however, the painting led to the downfall of both Whistler and Ruskin. Although Whistler won the libel action, he was awarded only a farthing in damages and was bankrupted by the expense of bringing the action. Ruskin's mental illness prevented him from attending court, and within months he had withdrawn entirely from public life. Following pressure from the leading painters of the Glasgow School, Whistler's portrait of the Scottish biographer Thomas Carlyle, his second arrangement in grey and black, was bought in 1891 by the Glasgow Corporation. This was the first time that a work by Whistler had been acquired for a public collection. In seeking to capitalise on the popularity of Japanism the following year, a Glasgow art dealer, Alexander Reed, who once shared a flat in Paris with Van Gogh, agreed to sponsor a trip to Japan for 2 leading representatives of the Glasgow School, Edward Atkinson Hornell and George Henry. Both painters were at the forefront of the Scottish art movement known as the Celtic Revival, and were well attuned to seeking and interpreting the distinctive characteristics of their own cultural identity. In 1895, following his return from Japan, in a lecture given at the Glasgow Corporation Galleries, Hornell found himself paraphrasing Christopher Dresser's view of the spiritual nature of Japanese aesthetics. Quoting from the New Testament, he answered the question that might naturally be asked of an artist who had visited Japan. What went he out for to see? And the appropriate answer might be given, a reed shaken by the wind. For to those acquainted even slightly with Japanese art, the words express the spirit and motif of its dainty achievements. In a dig at contemporary French painters, he added the Japanese aesthetics were the greatest impressionism the world has so far possessed. All useless details are laid aside, whereas we've been working too much on the surface and in striving to realize truth, have forgotten the spirit. There is no doubt that Hornell and Henry's 18-month trip to Japan caused a great stir. The former's paintings were a sensation, but sadly many of the latter's were irreparably damaged on the return voyage. Although Hornell's lecture was well received by the critics, in the event he was not the person who gave it. Instead, it was delivered by a close friend, John Kepping, principal of the architectural firm of Honeyman and Kepping, whose most prolific senior draftsman was Charles Rennie Mackintosh. It's not known if Mackintosh attended the lecture, but it's undeniable that a Japanese influence entered his work at the same time. A watercolour which he exhibited the following year, part seen, part imagined, was painted as a homage to his new love, Margaret MacDonald, depicting a slender female figure wearing a hairstyle and loose kimono gown, suggestive of Japanese. It inspired the decorative scheme for the Buchanan Street tea rooms, which Mackintosh designed for Catherine Cranston between 1896 and 1897. Working as a creative partnership, Mackintosh and MacDonald designed the Scottish Room for the 8th Vienna Secessionist Exhibition in 1901. The stark white room, decorated with 2 hanging panels of applique work, convinced several critics that the overall effect embodied a curious Japanese style. It was the elevated position of the gesso panels mounted right up against the ceiling that inspired Gustav Klimt similarly to mount his Beethoven frieze at the 14th Secessionist Exhibition the following year. But visitors to the flat in Glasgow, where Mackintosh and MacDonald moved in 1900 at 120 Main Street, would have been excused for thinking that they had been granted a preview of the Secessionist Exhibition. A German friend of Mackintosh, the architect and critic Hermann Mathesius, who practiced in Japan, wrote an article about the apartment at 120 Main Street for the journal Das English Haus. He highlighted the stark aspect of the white painted drawing room, commenting that the Glaswegians have borrowed the ideas that Whistler introduced into painting for the decoration of their rooms. For the dining room, Mackintosh covered the panelled walls in brown wrapping paper, inculcating a gloom reminiscent of Tanizaki's book In Praise of Shadows, which observes that the beauty of a Japanese room depends on a variation of shadows, heavy shadows against light shadows. It's so often dangerous to ascribe an intention to an artist, but in the case of Mackintosh, we know surprisingly little about his discovery of Japanese aesthetics. In an untitled paper on architecture given in 1893 at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow, he said, "I think we should be a little less cosmopolitan and rather more national in our architecture. New words and phrases will be incorporated gradually, but the wholesale introduction of Japanese sentences will be denounced, and rightly so, by the purist." 2 years later, he began work on what is now known as the Mackintosh Building at the Glasgow School of Art. It has been argued that the inspiration for his masterpiece came from widely different sources. A suggestion of Scott's baronial can be linked to a lecture which he gave in 1891 to the Glasgow Architectural Association, where he paid homage to Fyvie and Huntly castles. And certainly the south elevation of the school, perched precipitously above Sauchiehall Street, has an immediate resonance with the battlemented skyline of Fyvie Castle. But closer inspection reveals something entirely different. Hermann Mathesius' article, published in Das English Haus, describes the northern elevation without cornice or ornamentation. The walls stand stark bare as the pylons of the mosques of Isfahan. But any consideration of the south elevation should recognize the possibility that Mathesius may have introduced Mackintosh to Edward Morse's book, Japanese Homes and Their Surroundings, a seminal work published in 1886. An early drawing by Mackintosh indicates the use of horizontal windows punctuating the blank walls, which together with the alternating eaves line recalls Morse's illustrations of old houses in Tokyo. Clear evidence of Japanese detailing can be found in the exposed structure of the art school's roof. The airy expanse of Studio 55, the composition room, is made possible by the tall timber structures which stand not unlike the Japanese tora at either gable end. And on the floor below, Mackintosh designed a library that is without parallel anywhere in the world. Research published last year has likened the form of the library to a Japanese kura, or storehouse, which were increasingly fitted out as living spaces in the later Edo and Meiji period, as Japan's urban population grew rapidly. Designed to provide fireproof storage, the kura was a framed building with plaster walls prone to dampness. Such a space could be made habitable, but only by constructing a light framework of bamboo at a distance of 3 feet from the external walls. Upon this, cloth is stretched like a curtain, as Morse explains. Similarly, a false ceiling suspended by rope would complete the alteration from storage to residential use. It's perhaps tempting to believe that Mackintosh followed this entirely practical approach to fitting out his amazing library. From the steel beams above, he suspended a gridded ceiling on wrought iron straps, while bookcases were stretched between the timber uprights instead of cloth. There is no doubt that Mackintosh's design for the Glasgow School of Art is one of the most important transitional buildings in the history of architecture. It occupies a chapter all of its own in the story of modernism. Clearly, it is a fusion of different traditions, where Scottish and Japanese vernacular are sublimated in the same space. The contemporary Japanese architect, Shinichi Ogawa, reminds us, however, that architecture must be freed from all styles or concepts and be neutral. A neutral space becomes the foundation, promoting the exchange of human thoughts, emotions, and actions, and a horizon generating diverse interpretations, viewpoints, and functions. In the year before the first phase of the art school was opened, John Brown and Company, one of Glasgow's most prominent naval shipyards, had started to build a formidable class battleship for the Imperial Japanese Navy. At 15,000 tons, the Asahi, launched in 1900, was the largest battleship built on Clyde Bank. It was commissioned at a time of rising nationalism in Japan, a phenomenon witnessed by Hornell during his visit in 1893. The present war with China has done and will do more to unveil for us the real Japan, he wrote. We realize now that it is not only a land of cherry blossom and seductive tea house life, but the home of a brave and warlike nation. With the passing of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Agreement in 1902, several British yards were commissioned to build further battleships for the Japanese Navy. 3 years later, the Japanese and Russian imperial fleets clashed at Tsushima. The ensuing battle was the critical naval encounter of the early 20th century and resulted in Japan becoming recognized for the first time as a world power. An extraordinary achievement for the medieval country which my forebear had visited only 47 years earlier. Of the 35 ships forming the Japanese fleet, 18 had been built in British shipyards, including 8 of the 9 battleships. And by licensing the use of coincidence rangefinders, the British government gave the Japanese overwhelming tactical superiority over the Russian fleet, and a gunnery advantage of at least 2,000 yards. The resulting accuracy enabled the Japanese to destroy or capture 29 of the 38 Russian ships. The importance of the rangefinders has never been forgotten in Japan. They are immortalized in bas-relief on the Russo-Japanese war memorial of the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. The rangefinders were made in Glasgow by Archibald Barr and William Stroud, respectively professors of civil engineering and physics at Glasgow University. In 1911, Admiral Togo, the victor of the Battle of Tsushima, visited the naval shipyards in Newcastle and Barrow to give thanks for the deliverance of his country. And when he reached Glasgow, he went straight to the factory of Barr and Stroud to show his gratitude to the management and workforce. He simply said, "You won the Battle of Tsushima for me." In 1912, the year after Togo's visit to Britain, the emperor died and the Meiji era came to an end. In assessing the nature of relative understanding that had developed between Japan and the West during the previous half-century, the art critic Okakura Kakutsu, who adopted the name Tenshin, Heaven Heart, published his Book of Tea as a definitive guide to Japanese aesthetics for Western readers. When will the West understand, or try to understand the East, he asked. We Asiatics are often appalled by the curious web of facts and fancies which has been woven concerning us. Let us stop the continents from hurling epigrams at each other, he continued. We have developed along different lines, but there is no reason why one should not supplement the other. The East and the West, like two dragons tossed in a sea of ferment, in vain strive to recover the jewel of life. And I would like to believe that Tenshin's search for the jewel of life that he so powerfully evokes in this quotation comes close to defining the purpose for this conference. Thank you very much.